The Cuban Missile Crisis, a tense 13-day standoff in October 1962, emerged from the Cold War rivalries and the unique dynamics of U.S.-Cuba-Soviet relations. In 1959, Fidel Castro's revolutionary government overthrew the U.S.-backed Batista regime, creating a communist foothold in the Western Hemisphere. The U.S., alarmed by Cuba's ideological shift, imposed a trade embargo in 1960, which economically isolated Cuba. Castro, seeking survival and economic stability, turned to the Soviet Union. For Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev, this was an opportunity to gain a strategic ally near U.S. borders and counteract U.S. nuclear missiles stationed in Turkey and Italy. The Bay of Pigs invasion in April 1961 was a failed CIA-backed attempt to overthrow Castro. It pushed Cuba deeper into Soviet hands. Khrushchev saw an opportunity to not only defend Cuba from future U.S. attacks, but also to shift the Cold War's balance. By mid-1962, Soviet ships began delivering ballistic missiles and military personnel to Cuba under secrecy. While U.S. intelligence picked up on Soviet military activity, the scale and implications remained unclear until the fateful discovery in October. On October 14, 1962, an American plane captured photographic evidence of Soviet missile sites under construction in Cuba. The missiles, once operational, could strike United States within minutes. President John F. Kennedy was informed on October 16th, marking the start of 13 days of important decision-making. Kennedy convened the Executive Committee of the National Security Council to discuss. His advisors debated options ranging from airstrikes to a full-scale invasion. While military leaders pushed for aggressive action, Kennedy feared triggering nuclear war. Instead, he chose a naval quarantine to prevent further delivery of Soviet weapons to Cuba. This move was less provocative than outright military action. In a televised address on October 22nd, Kennedy informed the American public of the missile sites and the quarantine, warning that any attack from Cuba would result in a full retaliatory response against the Soviet Union. Around the world, people anxiously awaited the Soviet reaction. On October 24th, Soviet ships carrying military equipment approached the quarantine line. Tensions reached a height as the U.S. Navy prepared to intercept. At the last moment, the Soviet ships turned back, avoiding a direct confrontation. However, the missile sites in Cuba remained a grave concern. The crisis escalated further on October 27th, known as Black Saturday. A U.S. U-2 plane was shot down over Cuba, killing its pilot, Major Rudolph Anderson, Jr. This incident nearly triggered a U.S. retaliatory strike, but Kennedy held back, knowing such action could lead to full-scale war. That same day, a U.S. Navy destroyer dropped depth charges near a Soviet submarine carrying a nuclear torpedo. The submarine's captain, believing war had already begun, prepared to launch the torpedo. It was Vasily Arkhipov, a Soviet officer aboard, who persuaded the captain to stand down, narrowly averting disaster. Amid this chaos, diplomatic exchanges continued. Khrushchev sent Kennedy two messages. The first proposed removing the missiles in exchange for a U.S. pledge not to invade Cuba, while the second demanded the removal of U.S. missiles from Turkey. Kennedy publicly agreed to the first offer, while privately promising to address the Turkish missiles later. On October 28th, Khrushchev announced the dismantling of the missile sites in Cuba and the weapons were withdrawn under UN supervision. The crisis was over, but the lessons were far from forgotten. The resolution of the Cuban Missile Crisis marked a turning point in the Cold War. For President Kennedy, the peaceful resolution enhanced his reputation as a cool-headed leader. For Khrushchev, the crisis was a political gamble. Although he avoided war and protected Cuba, his perceived retreat weakened his standing in the Kremlin, contributing to his eventual removal in 1964. For Cuba, the crisis left mixed results. U.S. pledge not to invade ensured Cuba's survival as a communist state. Nevertheless, the economic embargo remained, leaving Cuba isolated for decades. As one U.S. resident said, "We watched the news every night, wondering if it would be the last time. The relief when it ended was overwhelming, but it also made us realize how close we came to the end of the world." The Cuban Missile Crisis stands as a testament to the fragile balance of power in the nuclear age and the importance of diplomacy and restraint in averting disaster. It remains one of history's clearest examples of how cooler heads can prevail, even in the face of existential danger.